Ethan Marlowe stood in his penthouse library, the Manhattan skyline glittering behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows. The room, designed to exude warmth and sophistication, was a haven of dark mahogany shelves, leather armchairs, and soft golden lighting. It was Claire's favorite space in their home, but one Ethan rarely visited. He was too busy building Marlowe Industries into a tech empire, a relentless pursuit that had crowned him as one of the world's youngest billionaire CEOs. But tonight he was restless. Claire had been acting distant. For weeks she'd smiled politely, kissed him on the cheek, and engaged in conversations that felt rehearsed. He'd brushed it off at first, blaming the demands of their schedules, but the growing void between them gnawed at him, a sensation he wasn't accustomed to. He'd built his life on control, and this, his marriage, his anchor, felt as if it was slipping through his fingers. As he leaned against a wall-mounted cabinet, pondering whether to change, his elbow bumped a hidden latch. A soft click echoed, and a narrow door swung ajar. Ethan frowned. This wasn't part of the original library design. He peered inside and saw a collection of trinkets, a delicate pearl bracelet, a stack of aged letters tied with ribbon, and nestled among them a small leather-bound book. The diary's faded cover bore the initials CM in Claire's unmistakable handwriting. He froze. Claire's diary? He knew he shouldn't invade her privacy, but curiosity burned through his hesitation. She'd never mentioned keeping a diary, let alone one hidden so carefully. With trembling hands, he lifted the book from its hiding place. His mind raced with questions as he opened it to the first page. The words written there hit him like a thunderclap. Every day, I wake up wondering if he will finally see the truth. If Ethan knew why I really married him, would he still look at me with those trusting eyes? His breath caught. The library suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. What did she mean by, why I really married him? They had met 6 years ago at a charity gala, her elegance and intelligence captivating him immediately. Their whirlwind romance had been the stuff of fairy tales. Or so he'd thought. He turned the page, his heart pounding like a war drum. Ethan is everything I hoped he would be. Brilliant, kind, and utterly devoted. But guilt eats at me every day. He doesn't know the real reason I agreed to marry him. It wasn't love, not at first. It was desperation. My family was drowning in debt, and his proposal was the lifeline I couldn't refuse. I thought I'd eventually fall for him, that love would grow with time. But here I am, years later, still wondering if he'll ever discover the truth. Ethan's chest tightened. Desperation? Debt? He'd believed their love had been mutual, spontaneous, genuine. Was he just a financial solution to her problems? Memories of their early days flashed through his mind, the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, the passion they shared, the plans they made for the future. Had all of it been a facade? He flipped through more pages, each entry peeling back layers of a reality he hadn't known existed. Claire wrote of her father's failed business, the creditors who hounded her family, and the fear that had consumed her before Ethan had entered her life. Her candid words painted a picture of a woman torn between survival and guilt, struggling to reconcile her choices. But then he read something that stopped him cold. And yet somewhere along the way, I did fall in love with him. I'm not sure when it happened. Maybe it was the way he stayed up all night nursing me through the flu, or how he always listens so intently, as if my thoughts are the most important thing in the world. He's everything I could have dreamed of in a partner, and it scares me to think I might lose him if he ever learns the truth. How can I tell him that our marriage began with a lie? Ethan's grip on the diary tightened. She loved him. That much was clear. But the foundation of their relationship had been built on a secret she'd carried for years. Anger and hurt swirled within him, battling against an unexpected surge of passion. Claire had been trapped in a situation he couldn't begin to fathom, and she'd made a choice to save her family. Could he truly fault her for that? He closed the diary, his mind a tempest of conflicting emotions. Claire's soft footsteps echoed down the hallway, drawing closer. Panic surged through him. He shoved the diary back into the cabinet and swung the door shut just as she appeared in the doorway. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice laced with surprise. "What are you doing in here?" He turned to face her, schooling his features into a mask of calm. "Just needed some quiet to think," he said smoothly. "You know how hectic work's been lately." Claire's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of wariness behind them. "You've been working so hard. I worry about you." For a moment, guilt pricked at him. He'd read something deeply personal, something she hadn't intended for him to see, but the questions gnawed at him. Was their life together a lie? Or was it possible to build something real on a foundation of broken truths? "I'm fine," he assured her. "How about dinner? Just the two of us. I feel like we haven't had a proper evening together in ages." Her smile was tentative but genuine. "I'd like that." That evening, Ethan observed her with a sharper gaze. The little things he'd taken for granted now seemed layered with hidden meanings. The way she nervously tucked her hair behind her ear, the occasional flicker of her eyes, as if gauging his mood. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. As they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Claire's laughter rang out at something he'd said. For a moment, the weight of the diary's revelations lifted. She was the woman he'd fallen in love with, the one who had filled his life with warmth and light. But the doubt lingered like a shadow. "Claire," he began cautiously, "do you ever think about our early days? How we met? How everything started?" She stilled, her wineglass poised mid-air. Her smile faltered but quickly returned, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course. Those were some of the happiest times of my life. Mine too," he said, his voice steady. "But I've been thinking. Sometimes I feel like there are things we've never talked about, things we've kept from each other." Her hand trembled slightly as she set the glass down. "What are you trying to say, Ethan?" He hesitated, torn between confronting her and protecting the fragile peace of the moment. "Nothing specific, just, I think it's important we're always honest with each other, no matter what." Claire's eyes searched his, a storm of emotions swirling within them. "I've always tried to be honest with you," she said softly, "but sometimes honesty is complicated." The weight of her words hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Ethan nodded slowly, unsure whether to press further. He knew he couldn't confront her now, not until he understood the full story. That night, as Claire slept peacefully beside him, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The diary's words replayed in his mind, a relentless loop of doubt and revelation. He had built an empire on logic and strategy, yet his heart now felt like a battlefield of contradictions. Finally, he made a decision. If there was more to Claire's story, he needed to know it, all of it. Not just for himself, but for the future of their marriage. The only question was how to uncover the truth without tearing them apart. Ethan Marlowe sat at the head of the long dining table in the penthouse, a coffee cup cooling untouched in his hands. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, but it offered no warmth. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions after last night. Claire's words had hinted at hidden truths, but she hadn't fully opened up. He felt caught between anger and understanding. He wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation for the betrayal lurking in the pages of her diary. But he also feared the consequences. What if the truth shattered their life together beyond repair? The idea of losing Claire made his chest ache. As the clock ticked on, his decision crystallized. If she wouldn't tell him the truth willingly, he'd find it himself. He had built Marlowe Industries by uncovering hidden opportunities and deciphering puzzles. Surely, he could do the same with his own marriage. That afternoon, Ethan called in sick, a rarity that sent ripples of surprise through his assistant. He had one goal: to understand the full scope of what Claire was hiding. He started in the library, searching the cabinet where he had found the diary. But beyond the trinkets and old letters, there was nothing else revealing. Frustrated, he turned his attention to Claire's home office. It was an elegant space, reflecting her personality perfectly, clean, organized, yet with a touch of whimsy in the art pieces adorning the walls. Ethan hesitated before opening the drawers of her desk. It felt intrusive, wrong, but his need for answers outweighed his guilt. He sifted through neatly labeled folders and personal papers. A few invoices caught his eye, transactions tied to an account he didn't recognize. Curious, he took a closer look. The payments were substantial, and all directed to someone named Marcus Flynn. The name sparked no recognition. Who was Marcus Flynn, and why was Claire paying him such large sums? By evening, Ethan was seated at his computer, digging into everything he could find about Marcus Flynn. The man's LinkedIn profile revealed he was a private investigator. Ethan's stomach churned. Why would Claire hire a private investigator? Was it about him, about someone else? The questions piled up, threatening to suffocate him. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He needed to confront her, but the timing had to be right. The stakes were too high to rush into this conversation without knowing exactly what he was dealing with. That night, as they prepared for bed, Ethan observed Claire closely. She moved through their shared routine with grace, humming softly to herself as she brushed her hair. She seemed so at ease, so oblivious to the storm brewing in his mind. "Claire," he said, his voice carefully neutral. She glanced at him in the mirror. Have you ever hired someone named Marcus Flynn?" The question was out before he could reconsider. Her hand froze mid-brush. For a split second, her face betrayed a flicker of panic before she masked it with a tight smile. "Marcus Flynn? No, I don't think so. Why do you ask?" Ethan's heart sank. She was lying. He could see it in the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided his gaze. "No reason," he said lightly, forcing a smile. "The name just came up in something at work." She nodded but said nothing further. Ethan felt a pang of guilt for playing games, but her reaction confirmed his suspicions. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than he had imagined. Over the next few days, Ethan immersed himself in unraveling the mystery. Between meetings and corporate obligations, he pieced together what little information he could find. He learned that Marcus Flynn specialized in uncovering family secrets, often for high-profile clients. This revelation only deepened the enigma. Was Claire investigating her own family, or was she digging into something, or someone, closer to home? His frustration mounted as the days stretched into a week. Claire remained the picture of poise, but her subtle unease didn't escape Ethan's notice. It was as if she knew he was watching her more closely than usual. The tension between them grew, a silent chasm that neither dared to address. On the 8th day, Ethan made a breakthrough. He intercepted a package addressed to Claire, a thin envelope marked with Marcus Flynn's office address. Ethan hesitated only briefly before tearing it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a report. His eyes scanned the text, and the truth unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. The report detailed the life of a man named Robert Turner. Ethan had never heard the name before, but the attached photo sent a chill down his spine. The man bore a striking resemblance to Claire, his sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes unmistakably similar to hers. Ethan's mind reeled. Was this her brother? A cousin? But the report held no mention of familial ties. Instead, it described Robert Turner as a man on the run, a con artist who had defrauded investors out of millions before vanishing years ago. The report also noted that he had once lived under an alias in Chicago, where Claire's family was originally from. Ethan's chest tightened as realization dawned. Robert Turner wasn't just someone from Claire's past. He was her past, her father. That evening, Ethan confronted Claire. There was no more room for doubt, no more time to tiptoe around the truth. "Claire," he said, setting the report on the table between them, "we need to talk." She froze, her eyes darting to the paper. The color drained from her face as she read the contents. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she sank into a chair, her composure crumbling. "How did you find this?" she whispered. "It doesn't matter," Ethan said, his voice firm but not unkind. "What matters is the truth. Who is Robert Turner to you?" Her shoulders trembled as she exhaled shakily. "He's my father," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "And everything in that report is true." Ethan's stomach churned. "You knew about this? You knew who he was? What he'd done?" "Yes," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "But it's not as simple as it seems." "Then explain it to me," Ethan demanded, "because right now it feels like I don't know the woman I married." Claire's confession came in waves, each revelation more shocking than the last. She described a childhood shadowed by her father's crimes, the constant fear of discovery, and the shame that followed her family after his disappearance. Her mother had worked tirelessly to shield Claire and her siblings from the fallout, but the scars ran deep. "When I met you," Claire said, her voice thick with emotion, "I thought I could finally leave all of that behind. I wanted a fresh start, a life where I wasn't defined by my father's mistakes. But the guilt, it never went away." Ethan stared at her, his emotions a maelstrom. He understood now why she had kept this secret, but the weight of her deception still lingered. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice soft but strained. "Didn't you trust me?" "I was scared," Claire admitted, tears streaming down her face. "Scared of how you'd look at me if you knew. Scared of losing you." Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Claire," he said, his voice steady, "I love you. But love doesn't mean much without trust. We can't move forward until we rebuild that." She nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. "I want to fix this," she said earnestly. "I want to make things right." Ethan squeezed her hand, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll do it together. But there's one thing I need to know. What's the real reason you hired Marcus Flynn?" Claire hesitated, her eyes dropping to the table. "Because my father's not just someone from my past," she said quietly. "He's resurfaced, and he's looking for me." Ethan Marlowe stared at Claire, her final words reverberating in his mind. "He's resurfaced, and he's looking for me." The weight of her revelation felt almost unbearable, a sharp twist in the knot of secrets that had tightened around their marriage. The room fell silent, the air heavy with tension. "When?" Ethan asked, his voice low but commanding. "When did you find out he was back?" Claire took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she clutched her wineglass. "About 6 months ago. Marcus Flynn contacted me after one of his associates spotted my father in Chicago. I didn't believe it at first. After all these years, I thought he was gone for good. But then I got a letter." She hesitated before pulling out her phone. From a saved file, she opened an image of a handwritten note. Ethan leaned in, reading the chilling words. "Dear Claire, it's been too long. I think it's time we reconnected. I'll be in touch. Dad." The handwriting was jagged, almost unsteady, but the familiarity of the tone unnerved him. "He reached out to you directly," Ethan said, trying to suppress the anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "What does he want?" "I don't know," Claire whispered. "He's never said it outright. Marcus thinks he might be looking for money. That's what he always did." Ethan clenched his fists. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Claire's secrecy, her payments to Marcus Flynn, and now this looming shadow from her past. Yet there were still gaps, unanswered questions that gnawed at him. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" Ethan asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "You could have come to me, Claire. You didn't have to face this alone." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't want to drag you into it. You've worked so hard to build your company, your reputation. The last thing I wanted was for my father's mess to taint your life too. And honestly, I was scared of what you'd think of me." Ethan softened, his anger giving way to a pang of guilt. He reached out, placing his hand over hers. "Claire, you're my wife. I don't care about your father's sins. I care about you. But this secret, it's put a wedge between us. I need to know everything if we're going to face this together." Claire nodded, her expression resolute. "Then you need to know the whole truth." The following morning, Claire sat with Ethan in the sunlit kitchen, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. She recounted her father's descent into infamy, a charismatic businessman turned con artist who had charmed investors out of millions. When his schemes unraveled, he fled, leaving Claire's family to deal with the fallout. They lost everything: houses, savings, and any semblance of a normal life. "I was just 16, Claire said, her voice trembling. "One day we were a respectable family, the next we were pariahs. People came to our house, screaming at my mother, demanding money. My younger brother didn't understand why his friends wouldn't talk to him anymore. And then my father, he just disappeared." Ethan listened intently, his jaw tightening as he absorbed her story. "And now he's back," he said grimly. "What does Marcus think his next move is?" "Marcus believes he's testing the waters," Claire said, "seeing if I'll respond to his messages. So far I've ignored them, hoping he'd give up and go away. But last week, Marcus confirmed he's still in Chicago. He's staying in some rundown motel under a fake name." Ethan's mind raced. This wasn't just about Claire's father, it was about protecting their life together. If Robert Turner wanted money, he wouldn't hesitate to use threats or manipulation to get it. And if the press got wind of the connection, the fallout could be catastrophic for both their reputations. "We need to confront him," Ethan said decisively. "I'm not letting this man haunt you anymore." Claire's eyes widened. "Confront him? Ethan, that's dangerous. You don't know what he's capable of." "And neither do you," Ethan countered. "That's why we can't sit back and wait for him to make the next move. We need to take control." She hesitated, fear flickering across her face. But Ethan's determination was unshakable. "You don't have to go," he said gently. "I'll handle it. But I can't do nothing, Claire, not when you're in danger." After a long moment, she nodded. "If you're going, I'm going with you. He's my father. I need to face him too." The next day, Ethan made arrangements for their trip to Chicago. He enlisted the help of his security team, ensuring they'd have backup in case the meeting went south. Marcus Flynn, now fully in the loop, agreed to accompany them. He warned Ethan and Claire to prepare for the unexpected. "Robert Turner is unpredictable," Marcus said. "Don't assume he's the same man you remember, Claire." Ethan appreciated the warning but remained resolute. He'd dealt with cutthroat executives, hostile takeovers, and boardroom betrayals. This was personal, yes, but he wouldn't let it intimidate him. Claire deserved peace, and he was determined to give it to her. They arrived in Chicago 2 days later. The city was unseasonably cold, a biting wind cutting through the bustling streets. Marcus led them to the motel where Robert Turner was staying, a dingy graffiti-covered building on the outskirts of town. Ethan could see the apprehension in Claire's posture as they approached the entrance. "Are you sure about this?" he asked her quietly. She nodded, though her hands were trembling. "I have to be." Inside, the air was thick with the stench of cigarette smoke and mildew. The receptionist, a surly, middle-aged man, barely looked up from his magazine as Marcus slipped him a crisp bill. "Room 214, he muttered. They climbed the creaky stairs, the tension mounting with each step. Outside the door, Marcus gestured for them to stay back as he knocked. After a moment, the door opened, revealing a gaunt, weathered man who looked older than his years. Robert Turner. "Claire," he said, his voice rough but tinged with recognition. "You actually came." The confrontation that followed was a whirlwind of emotions. Claire demanded answers, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come back after all these years? Do you have any idea what you put us through?" Robert shrugged, leaning against the doorframe with a nonchalance that infuriated Ethan. "I did what I had to do," he said, "and now I'm doing it again. I need help, Claire. I'm in trouble." "Help?" Claire repeated, incredulous. "You abandoned us. You left Mom to clean up your mess while you disappeared without a word." Ethan stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Whatever you think you're going to get from Claire, forget it. You don't get to waltz back into her life and make demands." Robert's eyes narrowed as he sized Ethan up. "Ah, the husband," he said with a sneer. "Big shot CEO, huh? Let me guess, you're the one footing the bill for her nice little life now." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "This isn't about money," he said coldly. "It's about accountability. Claire deserves closure, not more of your schemes." Robert smirked. "I think you're so noble, don't you? But you don't know the whole story." He turned back to Claire, his expression hardening. "You think I wanted to leave? I didn't have a choice. Those people I conned, they wanted me dead. Staying meant putting all of you in danger. That doesn't excuse what you did," Claire said, her voice cracking. "You didn't even say goodbye." "I did it to protect you," Robert insisted. "And now I need your help to protect myself." "These people are still after me, Claire. If you don't help me, they'll kill me." Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. "You don't deserve her help," he said. "You've done nothing but cause pain and destruction. Whatever mess you're in now, it's your problem." Robert's gaze darkened. "You think I care what you think? Claire's my daughter. She owes me." "No, I don't," Claire said firmly, her voice finally steady. "I don't owe you anything." The conversation ended with Robert shouting after them as they left the motel, his pleas turning to threats. But Claire didn't look back. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of liberation. As they drove back to their hotel, Ethan reached for her hand. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "I'm proud of you." Claire gave him a small, tearful smile. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ethan squeezed her hand, a wave of relief washing over him. They had faced the past together, and now they could finally start to rebuild their future. The drive back to their hotel was a quiet one. The city lights blurred past the windows, casting fleeting reflections across Claire's face. Ethan held her hand as he navigated the maze of emotions stirred up by the confrontation. Robert Turner was a man who thrived on manipulation, but Claire had stood her ground. Ethan couldn't help but admire her strength. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, breaking the silence. Claire nodded, though her grip on his hand tightened. "I think so." It felt cathartic, in a way. For years I carried the weight of his actions, the shame of being his daughter. But seeing him today, hearing his excuses, I realized I don't have to bear that burden anymore. It's his to carry, not mine. Ethan smiled faintly. "You're incredible. You know that?" Claire glanced at him, her eyes soft but weary. "I'm just trying to find peace. For us. I owe you that much." Ethan's chest tightened at her words. There was still a fragility in her voice, a lingering fear that he might see her differently after everything. He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We'll find peace together, Claire. No more secrets." Back at the hotel, Ethan received a call from Marcus Flynn. The private investigator's tone was grim. "We have a problem," Marcus said. "Your father-in-law isn't going to let this go quietly." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "I stayed behind to keep an eye on him just in case. He made a call after you left the motel. I couldn't catch the full conversation, but it sounded like he was trying to leverage your name, Ethan. He mentioned Marlowe Industries." Ethan's stomach dropped. Robert Turner was a con artist, and if he intended to use Ethan's name to orchestrate his schemes, the fallout could be devastating, not just for the company, but for Claire as well. "Do you think he'll act on it?" Ethan asked. "I'd bet on it," Marcus replied. "You need to be prepared." Ethan thanked Marcus and ended the call, his mind racing. He turned to Claire, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. He hesitated before speaking, unsure of how to broach the topic without alarming her. "Claire," he began, sitting beside her, "there's something else we need to talk about." She turned to him, her expression wary. "What is it?" "Father might try to use my name or the company for his schemes. I don't want to scare you, but we need to be ready for whatever he's planning." Claire's face paled, but she nodded. "What can we do?" Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "We fight back. We're not letting him drag us into his mess." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Ethan contacted his legal team, ensuring they were ready to counter any fraudulent claims tied to Robert Turner. He also looped in his PR team, crafting a strategy to mitigate potential damage to Marlowe Industries' reputation. Claire worked closely with Marcus Flynn, providing details about her father's past schemes that could help anticipate his next moves. Though the process was draining, it brought her a sense of empowerment. For the first time, she wasn't running from her father's shadow. She was taking control. Their preparations were put to the test sooner than expected. On the third day, Ethan received a call from... The news was worse than he'd feared. An anonymous party had reached out to several investors, claiming to represent Marlowe Industries. They were offering lucrative opportunities to buy into a secret project that didn't exist. Ethan immediately knew it was Robert's doing. The man had always been a master of deception, but now he was playing with fire. "We need to shut this down," Ethan told Claire and Marcus that evening. "If he's reaching out to investors, it won't be long before the media catches wind of it." Marcus nodded. "I've been tracking his movements. He's still in Chicago, but he's using burner phones to make the calls. It's tricky, but I might be able to trace his next move." Claire's jaw tightened. "I'll talk to him," she said suddenly. Ethan turned to her, alarmed. "Claire, no, he's dangerous." "I know," she said, her voice firm. "But this started because of me. If there's a chance I can convince him to stop, I have to try." Ethan shook his head. "You don't owe him anything, Claire. Let Marcus and I handle this." "But he's my father," she said, her voice breaking. "And I need to do this for closure, if nothing else." Ethan saw the determination in her eyes and knew he couldn't dissuade her. "Then we'll do it together," he said. "I'm not letting you face him alone." The next day, Marcus arranged for them to meet Robert at a neutral location, a small cafe in a quiet Chicago suburb. Claire was visibly tense as they entered, her hand clutching Ethan's tightly. Robert was already there, seated at a corner table with an air of feigned casualness. "Well, if it isn't my darling daughter," he said, his tone dripping with mock affection. "And the famous Ethan Marlowe. What an honor." Ethan ignored the jab, his gaze steady. "Let's cut to the chase, Robert. We know what you're doing, and it ends now." Robert smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not doing anything illegal, if that's what you're implying." "Don't play games," Claire said, her voice sharp. "You're using Ethan's name to run another one of your scams. Do you have any idea what that could do to us?" Robert shrugged. "It's just business. Besides, you two have more than enough to spare. What's the harm in spreading a little wealth around?" "The harm," Ethan said coldly, "is that you're risking everything we've built. And if you think we'll let you get away with it, you're mistaken." Robert's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "You think you can stop me? I've been doing this a long time, son. I know how to cover my tracks." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but I know how to make sure you're held accountable." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a detailed account of Robert's recent activities, compiled by Marcus. It included evidence of his fraudulent dealings and connections to other con artists. Robert's expression darkened as he flipped through the pages. "Consider this your warning," Ethan said. "If you don't stop now, I'll make sure this ends with you in prison." Robert's hand trembled slightly as he closed the folder. For the first time, a flicker of vulnerability crossed his face. He looked at Claire, his tone softer. "You'd really do this to your own father?" Claire met his gaze, her eyes brimming with tears. "You're not the father I remember," she said. "The man I loved is gone, and I won't let you ruin my life again." Robert stared at her for a long moment before exhaling heavily. "Fine," he said. "You win. I'll back off." Ethan and Claire exchanged a wary glance. They didn't trust his sudden compliance, but for now, it was a start. In the weeks that followed, Robert kept his word, at least as far as they could tell. Marcus continued to monitor his activities, ensuring he didn't resurface in their lives. Meanwhile, Ethan and Claire focused on rebuilding their trust and healing the wounds left by the ordeal. One evening, as they sat on their penthouse balcony overlooking the city, Claire turned to Ethan. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing by me, even when I didn't deserve it." Ethan took her hand, his gaze steady. "You've always deserved it, Claire. I love you, secrets and all." She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I love you too, and I promise, no more secrets." As they leaned into each other, the weight of the past finally began to lift. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together they would embrace the light of their future.